Right now, somewhere in your house, a machine is quietly working against physics to keep you cool. You barely think about it. You walk past a small box mounted on the wall, adjust a dial, and cold air appears as if summoned from nothing. It feels modern. It feels like something no one could have managed before electricity existed. But in a desert city that has stood for over 1,000 years, people were cooling their homes to temperatures that would surprise you today, using no electricity, no machinery, and no moving parts at all. And the strangest part isn't that they did it. It's that we spent the last century forgetting how. Here is the moment that reframes everything. Walk through the old quarter of a historic Persian desert city, and you'll notice something rising above nearly every rooftop. Tall, narrow towers, open on one or more sides, standing like silent sentinels against a brutal sun. These aren't chimneys, and they aren't decorative. They're called badgers or wind catchers, and they were pulling cool air down into homes centuries before anyone had heard the word refrigeration. Some of these towers have been in continuous use for over 1,000 years, in a region where summer temperatures regularly climb past 40 degrees Celsius. And they still work. The mechanism is elegantly simple once you understand it, though it looks almost magical from the outside. A wind catcher tower rises above the roofline, its top openings facing whichever direction the prevailing breeze comes from. As wind moves across the top of the tower, it gets funneled downward through the shaft, forced by simple air pressure differences into the rooms below. But the real trick isn't just moving air. It's what that air passes through on the way down. In many of these desert cities, engineers paired the wind catcher with something even more remarkable, a network of underground water channels called qanats, carrying water from distant mountain aquifers into the heart of the city. As the funneled air passed near the cool, damp channel below, it picked up moisture and dropped in temperature before entering the living space. No motors, no refrigerants, just wind, water, and a very precise understanding of how air behaves when you give it the right path to follow. Some of these wind catchers work in more than one direction at once. Taller structures were sometimes built with internal partitions splitting the shaft into separate channels, so that hot air rising from inside the building could exit through one side, while cooler air was pulled in through another, all within the same tower, all happening simultaneously, all without a single moving part. Engineers examining these designs today describe them as passive ventilation systems, meaning they rely entirely on natural pressure differences rather than fans or pumps. The taller and better oriented the tower, the stronger the effect, which is part of why certain wind catchers in these desert cities grew to become architectural landmarks in their own right, visible from far outside the city walls. Why does this feel like such a leap for people who had no concept of thermodynamics as a formal science? That question misses something important about how ancient engineering actually worked. These builders weren't working from equations. They were working from generations of careful observation, passed down and refined family by family, builder by builder across centuries. They noticed that thick walls stayed cooler than thin ones. They noticed that narrow, shaded alleyways trapped less heat than open streets. They noticed that certain tower shapes pulled air more effectively than others. And they built an entire urban environment around those observations, long before anyone could explain exactly why they worked. Here's the counterintuitive twist. Modern engineers studying these systems today aren't dismissing them as primitive workarounds. Research groups examining traditional desert architecture have found that well-designed badger systems can lower indoor temperatures by 10 degrees Celsius or more compared to outside air, using zero electricity in the process. Some studies conducted at architecture and engineering institutes have modeled airflow through these towers using the same computational fluid dynamics tools used to design modern aircraft, and found the ancient geometry surprisingly close to optimal for the climate it was built in. These weren't lucky accidents. They were solutions refined over dozens of generations, tested against the harshest possible feedback, whether people survived comfortable summers or didn't. The walls tell a similar story. Traditional buildings in these desert regions were often built from thick mud brick or rammed earth, sometimes more than half a meter deep. That thickness wasn't wasted material. It was thermal mass, a property that allows a material to absorb heat slowly during the scorching day and release it slowly at night, smoothing out the extreme temperature swings of a desert climate. A thin modern wall heats up and cools down quickly, chasing the outdoor temperature almost in real time. A thick earthen wall acts more like a buffer, lagging hours behind the outside world, so that by the time the wall's exterior has absorbed the day's peak heat, night has already fallen and the interior stays comfortable. Builders in these cities weren't fighting the desert. They were using its own rhythms as a tool. Even the layout of the streets carried the same logic. Narrow, winding alleyways, often just wide enough for two people to pass, created near constant shade throughout the day, since the sun could never fully reach the ground below. Tall buildings pressed close together reduced the surface area exposed to direct sunlight. Courtyards, often centered around a small pool or fountain, created their own microclimates, with evaporating water cooling the immediate air before it entered surrounding rooms. None of this was decoration. Every architectural choice, from the shape of a tower to the width of a street, was part of one continuous climate control system, built at the scale of an entire city. So why did most of the world walk away from all of this? Part of the answer is that mechanical air conditioning, once it became affordable, offered something these ancient systems couldn't: total, immediate control in any climate, without requiring specialized architectural knowledge or centuries of accumulated wisdom about local wind patterns. You could drop the same box-shaped building anywhere on Earth and force it to be cool with enough electricity. It didn't matter if the walls were thin, the streets were wide and sun-baked, or the building's orientation ignored prevailing winds entirely. Mechanical cooling made ignorance of climate affordable, at least for a while. That trade-off has a cost that's only become fully visible in recent decades. Research on urban heat islands, the effect where cities run significantly hotter than surrounding rural areas, has repeatedly identified dense concentrations of heat-absorbing materials, minimal shading, and heavy reliance on mechanical cooling as major contributing factors. Every air conditioner cooling an indoor space is at the same time pumping additional heat outdoors, warming the very city it sits in. It's a strange, kind of borrowed comfort. You cool your own room while quietly making your neighborhood a little hotter, and studies tracking electricity demand during heat waves have shown cooling loads spiking dramatically, straining power grids at precisely the moments people need relief the most. Does that sound like a system built to last? There's a deeper irony buried in all of this. The qanats that once cooled desert cities also irrigated their farmland, sustaining agriculture in some of the driest inhabited regions on Earth for thousands of years without depleting the aquifers that fed them, because the system only ever drew water that flowed naturally downhill by gravity. Modern groundwater pumping, by contrast, has been linked in hydrological studies to rapidly falling water tables in many of the same regions, as electric pumps draw water up far faster than it can be replenished. The old system cooled homes and grew food while barely touching the balance of the water table beneath the city. The new system, for all its convenience, quietly draws down the very resource it depends on. Here's what makes this genuinely hopeful rather than just a story about lost wisdom. In recent years, architecture and engineering institutes in several countries have begun studying and reviving passive cooling techniques, not as museum curiosities, but as practical tools for reducing energy use in new construction. Modern versions of wind catcher towers have been incorporated into contemporary buildings, sometimes disguised behind sleek exteriors, paired with materials engineered to have similar thermal mass properties to traditional mud brick without the maintenance challenges. Urban planners studying heat island effect have started recommending narrower streets, more shade structures, and lighter-colored surfaces, essentially rediscovering, through modern data, conclusions that desert builders reached through centuries of trial and error. You live, most likely, in a building that ignores almost everything those ancient builders understood. Thin walls, wide, sun-exposed streets, a single mechanical system doing all the work that an entire integrated design used to share. And when that system fails, during a heat wave, during a power outage, during exactly the moment you need it most, there's often nothing left to fall back on. No thick walls buying you time. No wind catcher pulling in a breeze. No shaded alley or cooling courtyard. Just a box, quietly straining, hoping the grid holds. Think about how differently you'd experience a heat wave if your home had even one of these features built in from start. A thick wall that took hours to warm up instead of minutes. A shaded, narrow approach to your front door instead of an open parking lot radiating heat back at you. A small courtyard with even a modest amount of water evaporating quietly in the shade. None of these require electricity to function, which means none of them fail when the electricity does. That resilience isn't nostalgic. It's structural. It's the difference between a building that depends entirely on one system working correctly and a building that was designed with several independent layers of defense against the same problem. This isn't a call to abandon modern comfort. It's a reminder that comfort built entirely on one fragile system is a different kind of comfort than comfort built into the bones of a place. The desert cities that engineered cool air from wind and water understood something that got lost somewhere between the invention of the compressor and the modern subdivision. That the most resilient solutions are usually the ones that work with a place's climate rather than against it, and that don't collapse the moment the power goes out. So the next time you adjust that dial on the wall and wait for cold air to arrive, remember the desert cities that solve the exact same problem you're facing with wind, water, and walls built to remember the sun. They didn't summon cold air from nothing. They built it into how a city breathed. And whatever comes after the age of easy electric cooling, the answer to staying comfortable in a hot world may not be a newer machine at all. It may be something we already knew, standing quietly above rooftops for 1,000 years, waiting for us to look up again.